No matter what you think about the whole situation surrounding the COVID pandemic, one thing is certain. It's also a sentence you hear incredibly often. We're living in crazy times. We're living in times where 5 years ago we would have said, oh, that's impossible. And more I also hear the question, how is this going to continue? Where is our society headed? This talk is a modest attempt to contribute to answering this question. How can we live in these times? Question. Who of you enjoyed reading Asterix when you were a kid? Okay. Who still enjoys reading Asterix? All my kids love Asterix. I also loved Asterix when I was a kid. Now, with Asterix, of course, everyone wants to be Asterix. No one wants to be one of the Romans. But just imagine now that you are a Roman. And not one of those fat legionnaires that Obelix beats up all the time. But imagine you're a Roman official. And not exactly in the time of Asterix, but a few hundred years later, around 400 AD. Let's say you're a provincial official in Raetia Secunda, that was in Austria, or you're somewhere in Italy or Tunisia, it doesn't matter. The Roman Empire was incredibly large, and now you're living there as a civil servant, and you've actually made yourself comfortable. And then you hear rumors saying, oh, there are some Germanic tribes or tribes in North Africa that are rebelling. You hear that the borders of the Roman Empire are starting to collapse, and you can't imagine that at all because the people in ancient Rome lived in a very orderly way. Every city had roughly the same layout. If you look around today, no matter whether you are in Libya, Greece, in Lebanon or France, you see that they all had amphitheaters and the cities all looked the same. There was an amazing social order, and at the top, of course, there was the Roman emperor or the Roman law. Then there was the transportation system, and it was all well organized. And that wasn't since yesterday, but this order, I'll call it the old order, was already really old. Imagine in the year 400 AD, the Roman Empire, or at least Rome itself, had already existed for 1,000 years. And a Roman Empire that was international had also existed for centuries. We must keep in mind what an incredible achievement of culture and stability the Roman Empire was. From today's Iran to England, and during its greatest expansion from today's Romania to Cologne or to Libya, you could pay with the same money, speak the same language. You had access to the same legal assets. You could probably even see relatively similar theatrical performances. And all this in the year 150 AD. You could send letters from A to B, you could travel from A to B. And for the Romans of that time, for that provincial official, it would have sounded ridiculous, like a bad joke, if someone had said, Rome is going to fall someday. Rome is going to fall? Come on. We've been around for thousands of years. There's never been an empire like that. How must that have sounded to them? Now, how must that have sounded for the Christians of that time? Because starting in the second half of the 4th century, the Roman Empire accepted Christianity, and there were figures like Augustine, who was bishop in North Africa in today's Tunisia or Algeria, who wrote a book called The City of God, in which he put all his wisdom about how the state and how God's order works into a single work. And no sooner had he finished writing it than the Vandals came and flattened the city, and he died in that situation. It must have felt as if the world was ending. Now, of course, I'm not saying that we're living in something similar to the barbarian invasions today. I'm just saying there were phases in history in which there were also great changes and upheavals. And I'm trying to talk about how we can live, I call it digital and without fear in this day and age. Because we too are experiencing that old orders are faltering, that things that were taken for granted decades ago or even just a few years ago have faltered and are now faltering. Imagine what happened during the barbarian invasions. Instead of the old order, there was a new chaos. But this new chaos was a transitional period. That means some of these institutions still existed. For example, the Eastern Roman Empire or some cities still existed. Some orders still existed, others no longer. Some cities lay in rubble and ashes. You couldn't simply get from A to B anymore. The same order no longer existed. Instead, you had completely new players. You had some mounted nomads from the east who rode from here to Spain, for example, the Goths, who just destroyed everything. And then there were the Vandals, the Huns, and it went on like this for a few centuries and chaos reigned. And yet, of course, people lived on. Not everything was bad, but a lot had changed. It was a time of new chaos. A transitional period until a new order could be established. That took a relatively long time. And I'd like to use this image of the barbarian invasions and the end of the Roman Empire, which many believe was eternal, as a metaphor for the situation we're in today. And today we don't have Huns or Vandals trampling our cities, but we're dealing with three megatrends that you are all familiar with anyway, that aren't new to you and that aren't bad. Well, to put it bluntly, the barbarian invasions weren't bad either. It was only a historical event. Historical events and epochs are neither good nor bad. They simply are what they are, and they bring specific challenges and problems, but also unique opportunities. And these three megatrends are characterizing our time, really the generation we live in today in a special way. I just said that in the Roman Empire you could have sent a letter from Cologne to Rome, for example. With a mounted messenger, it would have taken a few days. You could have also traveled on foot from Cologne to Rome. Then you would have probably gone for a few weeks. If you had sent a letter from Cologne to Rome 50 years ago, it would have probably taken 2 days. If you had traveled from A to B by car, maybe 12 hours or something. Later, a few years later, you could fly. That only takes 1 hour, and a letter is there in a day. An email is there in a second, and writing the letter takes half an hour. Writing the email only takes a few minutes. We have the first megatrend, an acceleration. This is not just as you subjectively feel so that you say, yeah, everything was more relaxed in the past, but the pace of life is actually increasing. It's not just that it seems that way, because we're all getting old or something. That's true, of course, but it's real. You can measure how long things used to take, also how many books were written in what period of time, and how much knowledge was produced. And this doesn't develop linearly, that is, a little more every year, but almost exponentially. So there are more books being published every day in German alone that you could probably read in the next 2 years. And that's increasing. In the next hour, so much YouTube footage will be uploaded that it would probably take you a couple of years to watch it, and you wouldn't feel any better afterwards. Most are just cat videos or something. But you also notice that the perceived pace of life is getting faster. Do you know how you notice that? By movies. For the past few days, my kids have been watching their favorite movie, Lord of the Rings, and that's now 20 years old. And I noticed that even in Lord of the Rings, the action scenes are cut much slower than the action scenes in today's movies. And that was only 20 years ago. Watch any crime show from the 80s in which a detective goes from A to B. You can go to the bathroom and open another beer while he's walking down the hallway because it's cut so slow. We can hardly stand it. We fall asleep because we're used to everything happening so quickly. Now I want to make this clear. We are the first generation to be hit by the full weight of digitization. So digitization in the last 30 years with computer and such. We're also the first generation in which more than half of all people have a smartphone. This means the acceleration of data exchange isn't happening out there in the financial markets, but in our pants pockets, in our living rooms. And you notice that. In the old days, you got a letter and thought, yeah, I'll write back sometime. A few years later, you got an email and said, well, an email should actually be answered within a day or two. How long do you take when you get a WhatsApp? You don't say, well, I can answer that in 3 or 4 days. If it's someone you care about and you haven't written back after an hour, they will file a missing person report and ask, are you still alive? We've gotten so used to it. That's why it goes bing. A letter used to lie around and you'd read it eventually, but now bing, I have to read it right away. It would be really bad because if I don't, something could happen. We're a generation in which the production of global knowledge is doubling faster and faster. What is global knowledge? It's just the number of homepages, of scientific articles, of books that are written. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting smarter, but at least that we're producing more knowledge. It used to take centuries for that to double, then it only took decades, and now knowledge is doubling. Estimates vary, but I don't know, once a year or once every few months. I don't know what the current estimates are, but it's incredibly fast. The problem is, the storage capacity of digital media is increasing constantly. The processor speed of computers is getting faster and faster, but we humans are not. We humans remain analog. Our brain is not getting faster. Our brain remains analog. And what happens if you have to process too much data in the same time? Now imagine you have 1 hour to read through 1 page, or you have 1 hour to read through 800 pages. You've got to go through it quickly in that 1 hour. And our brain learns more and more through this acceleration that we process knowledge superficially. As one of my kids once said, do I have to study this or can I Google it? We learn to briefly survey superficial, fleeting knowledge. And that also has advantages. But it also has its disadvantages, because what we unlearn is wisdom. Wisdom is different from knowledge. Wisdom is not gathering data. It's the ability to step back and evaluate it. That's something different. That's one of the reasons why the phrase, follow the science, doesn't make any sense. Because science initially only produces data and findings, but that isn't yet wisdom. Wisdom must weigh the different approaches and then ask, what should we do now? The data by itself doesn't tell you what to do. But in this acceleration, we think we're somehow getting smarter just by consuming more data. But we are not becoming smarter, we are becoming more superficial. Our thinking is becoming more superficial and rapid, you know? To think something new is uncomfortable. It really takes an effort of the brain. That's why we think what we think anyway, and the algorithms of the internet help us do that. But more on that later. What also happens due to acceleration is there is one main opponent of acceleration. The opposite of acceleration is relationship. Relationships require a slower pace. Imagine you are holding someone's hand and you are standing on a small carousel. It can also be pretty nice, but then you notice that certain centrifugal forces rise. Imagine it's a carousel like the ones you often find at a fun fair that spins very fast and then tilts up. You know them? Where it presses you against the side. This is called centrifugal force. And it becomes stronger the faster the object spins. And that leads to bonds breaking because the centrifugal forces increase. And that's what's happening to our society and also to our relationships. This is an effect of acceleration. One could also say this acceleration makes even the relationship with ourselves more and more difficult. Simply as an example, 100 years ago, people believed, well, if one day the machines will do the laundry or the dishes, People will eventually have so much free time. Robots will do the work, and people will only work 1 hour a day and have a lot of free time. That's what people believed 100 years ago. But it's not like that. We actually have to do less physical work, most of us. But the time we save, we put back into new things to be productive again in other ways. So internally, we don't feel like we have more time, because the acceleration is in us. We feel we have less and less time, so we ourselves become players in this acceleration. We keep making things faster. This means that if you can reply quickly on WhatsApp, you suddenly also feel you must reply quickly. So the acceleration is actually in us, and the consequences of that are absolutely immense. Every relationship thrives on deceleration, including the one with myself. John Mark Comer writes in this wonderful book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, "Hurry, constant haste, is a sociopathic predator that roams free in our society." It's indeed true. Haste is the killer of relationships. You could also put it this way: if you live faster, you'll be finished sooner. I learned the sentence from my friend Dominic Klenk. If you live faster, you'll be finished sooner. We have an increase in depression and burnouts because our heart and our inner self can no longer keep up with this acceleration. What also comes with this acceleration is a lack of clarity. I'll give you an example. If you wanted to read all the medical articles written by the research community around the world, you would have to read a few thousand every day. That means there is no one who can read all this. I think that even applies to COVID. I don't think there is anyone who has the time to read all the studies that are being done on COVID around the world. That is, there is no one who can say, I have all the scientific data on this. And that idea is a bit scary. With the acceleration also comes the feeling of lack of clarity. Many things are happening at the same time. You really don't know who to believe anymore. You believed something, but then the next already comes. How do we feel in such a confusing situation? Well, imagine you're in a room with many chairs and you see where everything is. And then you're supposed to walk through, no problem. Now imagine you're supposed to walk through this room blindfolded. Oh, now you're scared because you might run into something. What happens when things get too confusing is that you get scared. Fear is one of the consequences of this lack of clarity. And the faster and more complex our world becomes, the more afraid we are. But now we're not just afraid for ourselves, that we say, oh, that's so bad. What about the pandemic or the political conflict or whatever? But rather, we're all afraid at the same time because we're constantly connected in this acceleration. So first of all, the acceleration leads to increased fear, but we're connected in that fear. So I see, oh, they are scared. Then I see a headline, oh, they are scared too. Then I obviously have to be scared as well. And as a result, we increasingly behave like a herd of zebras. What happens with them? With zebras, or with another herd animal too, it's like this. If one zebra gets scared, the others notice, and within a second, they all run away. They decide in a split second whether to run away or what else to do. This is how herds react. Listen carefully. Herds don't react rationally, but in a herd instinct. Lower instincts rule in that moment. The more connected we are emotionally, because we are constantly bombarded by images, the more we react with things like fear or extreme opinions or anger. And that reinforces each other because that's a normal group dynamic. It's true. 100 angry people do something that one person alone would shy away from. I'd never do that. This is a herd instinct that can actually be observed with zebras. That means the acceleration is accompanied by a second megatrend, and this one, I'll draw it with a smiley, or with two smileys. One smiles, and the other looks sad. I call this trend emotionalization. By that I mean that things are charged with feelings that in reality may have nothing or not mainly to do with feelings. We can even notice emotionalization, even on the internet in real time. Yeah? You see a photo, but you don't write under it, "I like this photo." Instead, you put a heart under it. I don't know if I had sent someone a red heart 10 years ago. It would have meant, "Do you have a crush on me?" or something. Today, when I read a message on Twitter when Karl Lauterbach says, I put a heart under it. The growth of emojis. And then, oh, he's posted a really grim-looking emoji now. Is something wrong? Yeah, it shows that we're also becoming more emotional in our communication, but it gets much more blatant. Because we get our main input in the media through images more and more, through moving images, and images create much more emotion than a text. If you read, there are demonstrations in America because there was a violent incident with the police, you think, yeah, okay, let's see. But then you watch a video of a black guy lying on the ground and the cop is pushing on him and he says, "I can't breathe." You're like, how can this happen? And you react emotionally. In addition, everyone else is reacting emotionally too, because in a herd of zebras, everyone reacts emotionally. I want to be part of it. I'm also outraged by this injustice. What, you are not outraged? You didn't say you're outraged. So you're an offender, aren't you? You're not afraid of the pandemic. You think it's harmless, don't you? That is, we even become suspicious by how we express our feelings and whether we let ourselves get emotionally carried away or not. The normal is to go with the crowd's emotions. That's an outrage, and yes, we're all really afraid of it. And you absolutely have to be, because everyone else is doing it too. Once again, this goes right into our most private. Now, we humans don't easily deal with the feeling "I don't belong." We don't easily deal with the feeling "I'm the only one who sees it differently," or who isn't afraid, or who is afraid. And that hurts us. We are social beings. We need connectedness. And we let this topic, emotionalization, into our living rooms and even into our bedrooms. I can get up in the morning and find that 80 people are outraged by what I said about whatever subject. It's difficult for everyone when 80 people are outraged. And since we don't want to deal with that, we either withdraw and say, "I don't say anything anymore." I'll leave the public discourse to those who shout louder. Or I simply adapt. I seek emotional comfort in the group. I post what I get many likes for. If I get more likes with this hairstyle, then I'll just do this hairstyle. And that goes into the most private matters, from cosmetic surgery to political attitudes. How do I have to position myself politically so that many people say, "You're good, you're one of the good guys, you're on the right side"? Because we have an emotionally heated situation right down to politics. If you look at the political decisions of the last 5 years in Germany, but also internationally, you can see the harshness and the emotional caliber with which the shots were fired there. This keeps increasing. There are less and less prudent voices saying, "Hey, there are two very good views here. We should listen to both, mediate, and make a good decision together." This is becoming increasingly rare, and it's definitely a problematic development. The funny thing is that modern man feels incredibly autonomous. We think, "Today I'm free to think what I want." Exactly. But what you do is you just seek the comfort and applause of the digital public. You want to be one of the cool people who gets all the hearts on Instagram and Twitter. "I'm one of the good guys." Simply because we need that comfort and we seek the crowd's applause. And that affects politicians, journalists, teachers, and so on. It affects me. None of us is free from it. And of course, it produces leaders who act out of fear. It's important that you understand this. Once this emotionalization has a power, who has the strength, who can stand up inwardly and say, I don't care, bring it on, I don't care. It's just a few. It produces politicians, also spiritual leaders who adapt more and more and say the things that the crowd likes. And that's pretty concerning because leadership always has something to do with making decisions that not everyone will like. That's a real problem. Now we go one level deeper. This will be a bit more critical because the emotionalization and acceleration also creates groups that can benefit greatly from it. And who are they? We need to think about that. I'd like to ask you, what's the biggest market that currently exists worldwide? Which one is it? What's being traded there? One could ask, okay, what were the key technologies back in the 70s? Crude oil was really important. It's still important today, but it's not the most important commodity traded. Is it gold? No, not in terms of volume. What else could it be? Weapons? Food? No. I'll now introduce you to 5 of the 6 most important companies in the world. The ones that cost the most. One of them is the Saudi Arabian oil company, that's the 6th. I'll now show you the other 5. The first is called Apple, the second Microsoft. Just to give you an idea, they cost about 2 trillion or something. That's the market value. That's like the gross domestic product of Great Britain or something. Then Google is of course one of them, or its parent company, Alphabet. But I call it Google because everyone knows it. Amazon, of course, and Facebook, of course. And for comparison, Google, for example, is worth 1.5 trillion. That's $1,500 billion. That's 10 times what the Volkswagen brand is worth. Just to know. Let me ask you, what do these industries trade in? With Apple and Microsoft, you could say, well, with technical devices, okay, but why do they work? What do they do? And it becomes even clearer. What are Google and Facebook all about? It's interesting. Google and Facebook both cost nothing. How can they make money if it's free? Simple answer, they make money from advertising. And why is advertising worth it? Because today you've probably already used Google. You've probably used Google either today or at least yesterday, and Google can decide what you see. Which restaurant is displayed at the top when you type in good Italian? The advertising, which is then displayed at the top, is what Google thrives on. The largest companies in the world don't produce and trade in petroleum, weapons, and food. They trade with your attention. Your attention is the most valuable asset in these technologies. Because if we all stopped using Google, they would be broke tomorrow. If nobody clicked on Facebook anymore, it would be over for them. And then you wouldn't need any Apple or Microsoft products anymore because most of these products are no longer for industry but for leisure. You wouldn't need Amazon if you didn't pay attention to it. That means they are trading with attention. And it's very important to know. Do you know why Google and Facebook are free? Because you are the traded good. If something is free, you are probably the good that is traded with. What's being traded is every second you spend on Facebook, Instagram, or Google because what you look at is being measured, so they can recommend just the perfect shoes tomorrow at Zalando. And it's great because I also don't want junk recommended to me that I don't even want. But of course, in the end, I pay for it. It's an industry. They find out how you tick emotionally and then they give you more of it. That's the normal addictive cycle that sets in. I'm reading from a text by my friend Oliver Dürr, who is a great researcher. In this industry, the principle is, the more intense and regular the immersion is, that is, the more you're exposed to it, the more radical and lasting the morphological change in the neural networks of the brain. That means The more often you look at the device, the more something changes in your brain. These are habits of seeing and thinking. That's what data-driven attention capitalism ties into. So they know how you tick, and that's why they give you more of what you pay attention to, so then you pay for it. The digitally driven economy not only satisfies existing desires, they not only give you what you want, but also fabricate new ones. They make you want exactly that thing again. Learn to need what is offered to you. That's the principle. Learn to want more of it. And you support that because you click on it. You want to read that headline. You want to see how many people died there. And so we feed this machine ourselves. I'm not attributing this to some bad people out there. We produce it ourselves. And well, because there's still a lot of fear in the world, and because I can spend all day on Instagram looking at palm tree beaches, that's why these media are becoming more and more immersive. That means that you can sink into it better and better. Who knows what the group Facebook recently renamed itself? Exactly? Meta. And if you really want to see something crazy, check out the video on YouTube in which Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, introduces Meta. So we've learned over the last 2 years that you can hold meetings not only in real rooms, but also in virtual ones. We have a Zoom meeting. Where is it? Well, nowhere. We're meeting somewhere. This conference is also a live stream, and it holds incredible opportunities. But if you go one step further, you can ask, why don't we just shift our whole lives more and more into the virtual world? And that's exactly the vision of Mark Zuckerberg. And it sounds like a dream of a stoned when you watch the video. He says, okay, we can just shift more and more into the metaverse. And in the metaverse, you can choose how you look, what you can do, you can fly too. You can be a fairy. Why not? Why not be a fairy? But you can actually work there. You can have your co-workers in there. You might be based in Saudi Arabia or the other in Bangkok, but you're in the metaverse. And then you can play together, you can do all sorts of things. Watch movies together and of course work. Isn't that great? From all over the world, the metaverse is accessible and is increasingly replacing the real world. Sounds weird, sounds dystopian. Well, the guy talking about us is someone who owns one of the top 6 companies in the world. This isn't some gas station attendant here from the neighboring village, but a guy who somehow has $1 billion to do this. It's being built. And I'm not saying that to demonize it or to say that it's incredibly bad. We're part of it. But the question is, how can we shape this trend?
Have you noticed there are no ads on this channel? This is the only one. There's one reason for that. This channel is funded by donations only. If you want to help us to continue with this work, you find everything about supporting us below in the description. Now enjoy the rest of the video.
But the trend boils down to this. Because the world is getting faster and more emotional, and because there is so much fear. Hey, reality is difficult anyway. Let's just build fantasy worlds. And you can call that virtualization, that things are becoming even more virtual, but ultimately it's more and more about decoupling from reality itself. It's a fantasy world, an illusion world that the big companies are constantly working on while we support them. The entire Hollywood company Disney, also one of the real big companies, at least among the top 30s or so. Netflix, but also the whole computer game industry is working on nothing but a substitute for reality. Because reality, yeah, I don't know, there I have to go to school or I really have to meet a woman someday, that's cumbersome. I'd rather gamble, I'd rather run away. Or it's way cooler in the metaverse, so cool I can be anything there. And the great thing is that we can control everything there. In reality, you can't control everything. We're afraid of things that are unpredictable in some way. And dear ones, on the topic of augmented reality, virtual reality, we are increasingly reaching the point where reality and illusion are becoming more and more difficult to distinguish. I want to make that clear. It's going to be one of the great challenges of the future to find people who will just say, guys, this is all nonsense. We can have a Zoom meeting there, fine with me. Recently, Mark Zuckerberg also said there could also be churches, synagogues, and mosques. Fine, maybe someday we'll open up a house of prayer in the Metaverse, but it's not the point. We need people to remember reality and say, you know what, that's all well and good, but you know what you're never going to transfer into the Metaverse? Your body. Your here and now. Your real, actual reality as an embodied spirit. As a spirit in flesh and blood, created for other people, for love, for the here and now. In the end, it's just a fight against reality. I believe that we will enter more and more perfect simulations, and we will need people who stand up for reality. Chesterton said it 100 years ago. He said, one day the real heroes will defend such incredibly bold statements as 2 + 2 is 4 or water is wet. And it will seem like an incredible enlightenment when someone says that. And I think Chesterton got some things right. So it will be an act of faith to simply defend reality, to say, hey, this is reality. Because in the end, that's the reality. I've been thinking about this a lot over the last few weeks. In Judaism, the prohibition of images is strongly emphasized. Actually, the second commandment, depending on how you count them, I'll briefly add 3 megatrends. And this statement literally means, thou shalt not make thee any graven image. And then it says, neither of anything in heaven, nor on earth, nor of man. And of course, it's primarily about the prohibition of idolatry, because that's what the Old Testament is essentially about. But ultimately, we live in a world that's increasingly characterized by images. And these images that we see on the news define what we believe, what we fear, what we long for, what we aim for, what we desire. The power of images. And I'm preoccupied with a scene from the last book of the Bible, Revelation. It's a book that's not so easy to interpret, but it paints a striking picture of the end of the world. And without getting into theories like we're approaching the end of the world or something, I'd rather interpret what are the trends that are being described. And what strikes me is that there are 2 big movements. Ultimately, there are those who are faithful to God, who follow God, and those who allow themselves to be drawn into this anti-God, anti-Christian system. And they are said to worship the image of the beast. The beast is practically the word for a global ruler who is simply evil. Whoever you interpret that exactly to be. And this beast has an image, and all people worship this image, and the others worship Jesus, worship God. And what strikes me is that this greed for attention, which is fueled by fear because something could happen, I could miss something. It's ultimately a desire to prevent worship. And I don't mean that piously, that you absolutely have to do your squats in front of the Netflix movie. I don't mean that. But to whom you give your full attention, what gets your attention, you give power over your heart. And that's why it's not neutral. That's why I think one of the most incredible things we can do these days is to pray. Because by doing that, we are getting out of this carousel that wants to bind you, that would like to have us focus all our attention on our phone and not on our baby, not on our spouse, not on nature and not on God, but just stare at your device. And I'm talking to myself, I'm very digital. It's always a challenge. And that's why I'm saying, I now turn it off for an hour and pray, or I turn it off for a week. This is becoming an increasingly important act of global resistance. I deeply believe this, because it means I'm leaving this cult that everything revolves around and I give the most precious thing I have to God. And that's my attention. And it's financially the most precious, not just metaphorically. Now, of course, the crucial question is, Hartl, great, what do we do now? Yeah, I've drawn the systems now. We kind of have a new coordinate system that's being established, and we don't know exactly how. And the first tendency is people withdraw. Okay, end of the world, all bad, we have to retreat. And that's a wrong reaction. We shouldn't retreat. There's a small group of people from whom we can learn a lot. They've always lived in systems but haven't allowed themselves to be caught up by the systems. And these are devout Jews. For 2,500 years, Jews have lived in a multitude of societies and yet have maintained their own cultural identity. They first had to learn that in Babylonian exile. And I'm trying now in the second part, shorter than the first one, don't worry, to set up a few principles for surviving in a digital Babylon. I'm not saying that everything is Babylon, but in the sense of we're in the system that we can say, wow, it's definitely not everything cool, but we also don't want to run away. We want to be in the middle of it, but maybe not participate in everything. There's a scripture that sums it up very well. Paul says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is." He says, you have to stop conforming to some things first, so that you can prove and recognize what the will of God is. And the Greek word that's here, don't conform, is not so well translated. In Greek it says, gGmbH. That means the word scheme is in there. So cis means together and schematizeste means to be schematized, to be pressed into a scheme, a pattern. Paul says, don't let yourself be pressed into the same pattern as everyone else. That's a strong word. So stay in the world, be there for people, and don't isolate yourself, don't flee from it. But the system on the outside shouldn't become the scheme of your inside. I like snorkeling, and if you complain in the ocean that the water is so murky, you can do that. But you can also check whether your own diving goggles aren't fogged up. Yeah, sometimes people are, oh, the world is so dark. Yeah, I know, but your diving goggles too, they're fogged up too. You can start by not allowing yourself to be schematized. Then you can also see more clearly again. And you're not always responsible for the whole world anyway, but for your inner life, you do have a responsibility. Don't conform to this world. The point is, we are taught and instructed by the media for dozens of hours every week. We learn from Hollywood what relationships look like, what normal is, how to treat each other, how to talk, how things are. We learn that from the internet. And the most powerful way we humans learn is by following a model. We unconsciously imitate what we see. And we were instructed for hundreds of hours. That's actually quite normal. That's quite normal too. We allow ourselves to be schematized. We need times where we step out and say, wait a minute, are you still sane? This is not normal. This is not good. And you can approve it 1,000 times or say, that's a human right. We live in the 21st century. You know, the argument that we're in the 21st century is like saying 2 + 2 is 5 because today is Tuesday, not Monday. That's the same argument. So just because time passes doesn't mean that something false suddenly becomes true or vice versa. That's simply not the case. It's only when you are in an acceleration circus where you have no inner center at all that you believe that. So how can you survive in this digital system? I'll give you 5 short skills. I only do those in passing because they are very simple. And after that, I want to say something about how we can actually make a difference in all of this. The first, don't get sucked in. Every narrative wants you to go along with it, to believe it. Take a step back and say, hey, you know what? Maybe you're both wrong. Maybe you're right. I enjoy listening to this, but I won't get sucked in. Because that's what the emotionalization does. It wants you to stop just looking at things, but to bet money on one side inwardly. And then you defend it because it can't be that you weren't right. Maybe you were wrong. Don't get sucked in. The second, very good, slow down your reactions. The speed causes you hear something and answer it immediately. It would be very wise to say, you know what, I'll comment on that in a month. My kids always joke about it because I've made it a habit of using an expression, namely, I haven't formed an opinion on that yet. And that's true for most things, because I don't understand most things at all. If you were to ask me something, I don't know, I'd have to look into it first. Not be quick to judge by saying, this is a complex issue, I want to think about it first. All this media hype, it's incredible. I love Twitter in that regard. You have to look at what people were writing a year ago. You can't stop laughing. It's almost all nonsense. If you had waited 3 weeks, it would have all faded away and we would have known much more precisely how it really is. Yeah? Slow down your reaction. The third, don't have an opinion on everything. There are issues that are war-deciding, and then there are many that aren't. We should know very well, also as Christians, where is it really a matter of your ultimate loyalty to the true and the good? And what are issues where I would say, I don't think it's good, but I don't have to go to battle for it. And you have to decide that for yourself. What are those issues for you? But you can't make everything your issue. Fourth point, talk to people. Every one of us lives in a bubble, and the algorithms ensure that you are surrounded only by opinions that suit you. Talk to people, real people, especially those who have a completely different opinion. And dear ones, the church, Christians, should and must be the space where people with very different opinions can talk to each other. We have a common foundation in our belief in God, our belief in Jesus. And beyond that, there has to be a great freedom to say, wow, I don't think what you are saying makes any sense. It even annoys me. But at least I understand it a little better now. Let's discuss it. It's absolutely fundamental to live this reconciled diversity, but also to struggle for the truth, even when the issues are polemical and emotionalized. We must be witnesses of unity to this world, because this world will have less and less unity, at least for the foreseeable future. These centrifugal forces will increase, and we shouldn't play along. But how do we live instead? I thought about this situation, about the barbarian invasions, about the collapse of the Roman Empire, and I thought, well, who were men and women who made a difference and did good back then? And I remembered a person you probably don't know, and then I studied his life a bit. One of my brothers has the same name, so I know the name quite well. It's Saint Severin of Noricum. Noricum was an area that also included Austria. He then also worked in the Passau region of Germany. And the interesting thing is, he died yesterday 1540 years ago. So when I was preparing, I thought, wait a minute, while I am talking about it, it's the anniversary of his death. And that was pretty much 1540 years ago. He died in 482. And during this time of migration, when Noricum was attacked by pagan peoples and the Roman order was broken, he gathered up a group of believers around him and created stability in his region. He ensured the food supply. He even mediated between the Germanic and the Roman people who lived there. Truly a man of peace. So he founded a community of monks. Eventually, they had to flee to Italy because it got too dicey. But he was able to make sure they left off well. That is, he was a man of peace in a stormy time. And in the end, it was such men and women, and especially the monasteries, that provided a place of stability during the migration. Around 450, the first monasteries were founded again in Europe. Around 600 AD, they started teaching Latin. In this turbulent period, they rediscovered the classical sciences. And I ask myself, for all the upheavals, No matter what else comes in the next few years, how can we produce such a quality of people and communities? Because personally, I'm relatively optimistic that COVID will end someday and, I don't know, maybe the next 20 years will be quiet and stable. So I'd be happy about that, but we must also not forget the last decades after the Second World War were very stable in Europe. That's not normal. And I don't want to be the bearer of bad news because I'm not an insanely prophetic person, but there are all kinds of scenarios of what can still happen in global events. A world economic or supply crisis can arise. A meteor impact can happen, which is then followed by a natural disaster that no one talks about. Or if the internet simply went down for a few months because, I don't know, all the satellites were broken. What would the world look like if we had no internet or no telecommunications for a few weeks? These are totally conceivable scenarios. Or another pandemic. I'm sorry to say, it's not said that this will be the last one, and there are much more deadly viruses than corona. How would we actually deal with that? Seriously, how would we actually deal with the supervolcano erupting in Chile, which happens every 50,000 years, and the last time it happens was 40,000 years ago? Or if there were simply 2 years of crop failures around the world? And are we afraid of such things? I wouldn't wish for it, but hey, we're living in a transitional period on this side of eternity anyway. Peace, security, and stability are not promised to us on this side of eternity. On this side of eternity, there will be wars, hardships, troubles. There will be divisions. This is human history. And it would be awful if we were fair weather people just hoping to get our pension checks on time. You are truly made for something greater. And the image I took away from Severin of Noricum, which I like very much, is he was like a tower of strength and like a tree around which there was a lot of new chaos, but which was planted in the middle of a turbulent time and still bore fruit. And while I was preparing for all of this, I came across a very touching and beautiful passage in the book of Isaiah that I would like to read to you now. I personally find it so touching. God says, "And your soul shall be like a watered garden, and like a spring whose waters don't fail." I find it absolutely touching that God has this vision for human life, that He says, "I want your life to be like a watered garden." So here is water, and that your soul never pines away again. Because no matter what else happens with acceleration, digitization, emotionalization, these are real people around us. These aren't evil, terrible, and bad people, but simply people. People who are searching. Dear ones, really have mercy on me when I talk about this. It almost brings tears to my eyes. How many people pine away emotionally, who are getting more and more lonely, who burn out more and more, who become more and more broken, who have more and more unstable relationships, and are therefore unstable and have nothing to hold them together. It's this being grounded in love that they don't have and therefore so languish. And what difference can people and communities achieve for the future that are like a watered garden? Yeah, like Saint Severin, who was able to provide stability and food supply even among the hostile Germanic population. What would such a life look like? And dear ones, I believe the first thing that will mark such communities and individuals in the future is the theme of worship. Because this fight for your attention, to follow the image, this is becoming more and more blatant. And we have political and economic power mechanisms that say, and we want you to do, believe, and feel exactly this and that. That's getting even greater. And the ultimate resistance is to say, you know what? The highest good isn't even my freedom, isn't even my life. It's certainly not my comfort. The highest good is that before which I bow my knees. Who you worship ultimately determines who you are and who you become. Worship is the order and anchor of reality in an ever-growing fantasy world. Worship is not a psycho trip. Worship is order. Worship is the recognition of what reality is, that you are a creature and not the creator. That's worship. The second, Saint Severin and the other monks gave themselves a rule of life. We live in a time of extreme individualism, and that's also good. Individualism is important, that people can break out of structures, can define for themselves how they want to live. That's important. Modernity was also a liberation from oppressive structures in which the individual couldn't even breathe. But now there is a second step, namely the question, how do we want to live now? And there we have increasingly such an abundance of options that individuals no longer have the opportunity to find out how they should live. We need communities, churches, and people who don't just talk blah about God, but also suggest, look here, this is how life can be lived well. This is how human life can flourish, but who can also warn against chaos. By that I mean, we really like people who market a little bit of faith and a little bit of feel-good spirituality, which doesn't hurt anyone. I probably do that myself sometimes. And there's nothing fundamentally wrong with this either, but we must also speak up and warn against paths to chaos. You could also put sin in there, but sin that sounds like moralizing. There are things, if they topple over in your life, then your whole life goes to the dogs. And that is the power of evil. And we must warn against that and say, hey, when the power of chaos reigns within you, it doesn't help to say, I'm free to do what I want. If the chaos is in you because you're having suicidal thoughts, because you're depressed and broken inside, it doesn't help anyone to say, do what you like, I don't want to impose rules on you. You need someone to say, hey, I've been through a lot myself and I can show you a way to live a good life. Not because I always follow it, because it's not about me as a person or you as a person, but because there is a basic order of human life that comes from God. It will be elementary to answer the question of community, because what our modern age is not so good at, it can generate spaces of freedom, that's good, but it's not so good at building long-term communities. We need communities, and it can't just be family. I'm a big fan of family, and we absolutely need stable and healthy families. But there are a lot of people, and there will be more in the future, who don't have that, whose relationships have broken down, who long for it but are single, who have come from a failed relationship. And we need spaces where friendship, community, and cohesion can be lived out, and not only in the family. And such communities may even have admission criteria. A community that says anyone can join and it doesn't matter if you contribute or not will not be a community. A community thrives on commitment and on saying, these are our rules, and if you want to belong, this is how we live. If you have a knitting club and someone says, I don't want to knit, I want to play music. It's nice when one person plays music, but if at some point half of the members say, we don't want to knit anymore, we want to play music as well, then it's no longer a knitting club. Then you have to dissolve or open something new. But let me put it this way. When people say, hey, let's just hug everyone, no matter what everyone feels, thinks, believes, and lives, this will be a community that ultimately won't last, because this kind of community costs nothing and therefore creates no bonds. We will need digital fasting. I'm not preaching the exit from digitization. On the contrary, I think we need people who are present in the digital media, who make a difference, who produce good content, because that's where the people are. We are not of the world, but in the world. But it's all the more urgent that we keep prescribing digital fasting for ourselves. One of my kids has switched the phone to gray tones. You can try that too. Why? Because then there's less dopamine in the brain, less fun, less addictive. Give it a try. Settings, screen, color, grayscale. Yeah, how do you fast digitally? Digitization provides you with dopamine kicks, and that's addictive. Dopamine is always you find something or something is flashing, press it, bing. When you fast digital media, it doesn't feel good at first. Fasting never feels good. Not right away, but it makes you free in the long term. And just as we need physical fasting, this is important. Even many non-religious people are discovering that, which I think is great too. We're going to need digital fasting as a core spiritual discipline in the future. And those people who can still read texts and concentrate, real books made of paper, they're awesome anyway. You don't even have to charge them up or turn them on, they're awesome. So those who can still read books will have an incredible competitive advantage in the future. I deeply believe that, because that's how human thinking works. The last two things. Now, community is more important than personality, because we also have a cult, like there are such personalities and stars and you emulate them, and then everyone is disappointed when the big star falls, when a scandal comes up, because we followed people, and that's not really what we're supposed to do. It's much more exciting by which rule the community lives. And if someone messes up and doesn't behave according to the rule, well, fine, the Benedict rule still exists after 1,500 years, although no Benedictine has ever followed it. Just kidding. No, sorry. Well, we all fail by our rules. We all fail at what we want to embody. But it's not about emulating stars, not even religious stars. Rather, we need communities that live by rules, where people say, this is how life succeeds. It doesn't matter whether the individual is always a great example in this. The only authority that such people radiate, like Saint Severin, what was it like with him? Why did people believe him? He was no political leader, he had no army. Why did even the barbarians, the Germanic, listen to him? I call this authority through love. Look, in the end, it's not so bad if some of the structures collapse, because you know what? That wasn't the kingdom of God anyway. It was just the old order. And stop looking back at how good it was before. It wasn't good before either. It was just different. Was the Roman Empire good? Some things were good, some weren't. And some is only now breaking. It's always tempting for more conservative people to say it used to be better and now it's really bad. I want to call us out on that. No. It's a transitional period and old forms of authority may not work anymore. Then you say, but it's always been this way and I studied this. What will remain believable is authority through love, that people sense, hey, this is a loving person. This is a person who lives what he says. And the last point, that's why the talk is called Digital and Without Fear. In a world where everything revolves around and is fueled by fear, an incredible radiance will emanate by people who are simply not afraid. So the most revolutionary thing will be to say, yeah, I'm listening, but you know what? I'm not afraid. And I'll post something and I know I'll get a shitstorm. But you know what? I'm not afraid because that's the truth. And I'll stand up for something that you might disagree with, but I'm just doing it because it's the truth and I'm not afraid of it. And someone who isn't afraid in the midst of a world driven by fear, you know what someone like that is called? A leader. If the herd of zebras runs away because they're scared and one zebra just stops, the others will, I don't know about zebras, it's definitely true of humans. Another example, when a group of people gets lost in the woods and one person says, you know what, I think it's going that way, just because he's fearless and exudes authority, other people automatically respond to him. In the future, we will need communities, people and leaders characterized by fearlessness. What's my answer about how we can live in the future? Simple? It's not simple. But stay without fear and don't let your nerves get the best of you. Then you say, but the Germanic tribes will come and flatten everything. Just stay there. Don't be afraid and don't lose your nerve. But there is a meteor's impact. Just stay there and don't lose your nerve. But there's a new COVID variant. Just stay there, don't lose your nerve, don't be afraid. And this thing will shine. This thing will shine because people long for it. Digital and without fear. I'd like to end with a quote from a truly fearless man who, of course, lost his head for standing up for the truth. That can happen too. But there is worse than that. It's even worse when you deceive yourself and betray the truth. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, executed by the Nazis in 1945, wrote, "Not the arbitrary, but the right doing and the daring. Not hovering in the possible, but bravely grasping the real. Not in the flight of thought, only in the deed is freedom. Step out of fearful hesitation into the storms of events carried only by God's command and your faith, and freedom will embrace your spirit rejoicing." That would mean living digitally and without fear. And that's what you are called to do.